As a large island in the Mediterranean, Corsica has long been inward-looking. Its violent history over the centuries pushed people to take refuge in the interior of the island. The Saracens beleaguered the coastline and threatened the interior. To protect themselves, the Corsicans built villages high up on natural promontories, like so many impregnable citadels. They fixed their rustic houses to the mountain, even though they hung over sheer drops. The Corsican village, the perched, is the protector, and it's the very soul of this island. Many of these villages, which survived for centuries, are deteriorating because they've been deserted. Like this inaccessible Fiuminale Suttanu, a village in Castagniccia that was abandoned in the early 1980s when its last resident died. Fiuminale Suttanu is now the day-to-day existence for 4 men who were taken by a passion to save this village. The first to come back to the village was Jean-Andre, a young shepherd of about 30, who one day brought one of the houses in Fiuminale to live there. He was helped by Orso, a solitary man who lived an hour's walk away from Fiuminale. Most importantly, there's Andre, the retired police officer for whom this village represents so many memories. And finally, Jean-Marc, who's a driver on the Eastern Plain. All 4 of them are finishing the refurbishment of the village's small chapel, one of their first restorations after 3 years of work.
When we arrived, the chapel was a blackberry bush. A blackberry bush covered in ivy. We started to cut into it, until at the end of the chapel we found this altar. And we gradually uncovered the house. We could see the sun start to come into it again. The walls were damp and started drying out. And every week when we came, we could see it differently. When you see the bell tower, we dismantled it completely. I took photos. We dismantled it completely and put it all back together identically with the same stones. The cornices and everything. We rebuilt it with the stones that were here. It was about to fall down. It was leaning like this. We took it all down and put it back together.
I remember the village from the 1980s, when I was still a child. It had already started to deteriorate, but not to this extent. Now it's become a pile of ruins. Unfortunately, we can't do everything. The houses are mainly jointly owned, so... This has deteriorated quite a lot, unfortunately. The weakness of these houses is the roof. There's so much weight with these low stones. As soon as there's a weakness, it goes. It takes some time. But these houses are jointly owned.
Given the work there is to do, and given the number of heirs, no one's brave enough to start the rebuilding. And sometimes when they fall out, they prefer to let things get to this stage rather than selling it all to one of them who might intend to rebuild it. Through animosity, through family worries, through stupidity.
Joint ownership is the inheritance tragedy of Corsica. How many houses are there in ruins like this? The laws passed in 1801 to prevent the agricultural breakup of Corsica, which still govern the inheritance system on the island, mean that some buildings today belong to up to 100 heirs, who are mostly impossible to identify. The houses are therefore impossible to sell and in the end destined for ruin.
Bon, allez, enlève. Catch.
Ça, c'est celle que...
Catch. Allez, power. Voilà. Eh oui. Dopo qui domanda culla. Qui domanda culla così. No, fa passare.
It's things like this in life that mean that friendships can't be broken. When you have this in common, other people might be attached to other... For us, it's this. This is the Green Palace. Everywhere you look, there's nothing but green. There was a Corsican bandit who called himself that. When he wrote to the authorities, he signed himself the King of the Green Palace. And when you live in this environment, you realize what that meant. Because you have nothing. There's only the mountain, chestnut trees, oak trees, and that's all. When you're in the middle of this, you're in a green paradise.
For me, the best festival is Easter. With the procession, we all come together, we're all together, we sing together, and we pray together.
Across Corsica, island life dances to the rhythm of Christian traditions, and Good Friday is one of the high points of this religious fervor. The Easter procession in Val d'Orez unites many villages whose residents walk in families from chapels to churches, covering about 10 kilometers throughout the countryside. The future of these small village communities lies with the children who learn these popular traditions very early.
We're happy to be here, as every year. Everyone together, sharing it, especially family, friends. My daughter has been here with her friends since they were babies. We need to continue this tradition. It's important for the future, for our children, for us.
The race will start in 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Through their history and their culture, Corsicans have inherited a love of gambling, another way of celebrating and meeting together. Since 1928, the racecourse in Viseo has welcomed neighbors, cousins, and tourists at the foot of the famous Bavella Needles. At an altitude of over 1,000 meters, it's the highest racecourse in Europe and the most visited on the island.
You need to bet on number 12, which is second favorite. If number 11 doesn't win, I'm going home.
I bet on both number 11s.
Viseo is a bit like a compulsory pilgrimage, a place and a party not to be missed, lasting all summer with moments of exaltation for the winners and of disappointment for the losers. Far from the tourists and the summer visitors, the villages become little worlds on the fringe of time, like history frozen in the silence.
When I arrive in a village, I tell myself it's my village. For every village, I tell myself it's my village, and I must take something fitting from it, which is worthwhile.
For 35 years, Joseph Orsolini has been drawing the island's villages in order to keep a record of this architecture of stone, wood, and earth, which was the model for existence over so many centuries.
It's the history of people above all. I always imagine that every house backs onto or leans against the next one in a way that depends on a state of mind, and that has systematically created over the years, over the centuries, a powerful architecture. Sometimes I draw a tower like this. It's part of a grouping. That's the same view in a slightly narrower aspect, with a lock.
An architect by training and a former advisor to the Corsica Regional Nature Park, Joseph Orsolini has already made over 2,000 drawings to record the art of living in centuries past. His work is unique, a testimony to the culture and identity of Corsica as expressed in this popular architecture.
That's a nice grouping, Mont Rossi. It's a nice grouping, and it's still intact. In the same place, I drew this one with the oven there. The main quality of these villages is that they're worthy and therefore simple. It's their simplicity that makes them strong. Travelers from Tuscany and Lombardy in the 14th and 15th centuries, when they came to Corsica, were always surprised by the quality of the walls of the houses. They had seen so much light, so many riches elsewhere, and they were surprised by the quality of the walls of the houses.
In the last century, Corsicans abandoned the mountains for the big towns along the coast. Bastia is typical of a Genoese town. It was the citadel of the former Italian Republic, and for a long time it was the military and economic capital of Corsica. An Italianate fortified town, Bastia is first and foremost a port, one of the largest in the Mediterranean, with over 2 million passengers a year. The capital of southern Corsica, Ajaccio, is the imperial city where Napoleon Bonaparte was born in the 19th century. It was a fashionable holiday resort that attracted the bourgeoisie from all over Europe. All the towns that grew up on the coast were firstly citadels and strongholds built by the Genoese. Like Calvi, this powerful citadel that was never conquered in spite of the many attacks by the French and the British Navy. Today, Calvi is the tourist capital of the Bologne. In the far south, on a promontory of limestone cliffs, Bonifacio dominates the sea. A military stronghold for centuries, Bonifacio is a special town in Corsica, as it marks the border with the other Mediterranean world, nearby Sardinia. All around Corsica, the Republic of Genoa patiently constructed a system of defense to protect its coastline. 90 watchtowers sited on natural promontories were built to warn of imminent danger from the sea.
They feared pirates. That's what the watchtowers were for. Pirate fleets were the main enemy. When all the towers were in place, they formed a network which could pass messages from one tower to the next. But that wasn't the main purpose. The main purpose was to warn the people round about. They would sound the alarm with the coulon. It was a sea conch. When you blew into it, it made quite a powerful noise, so you could warn the people in the area.
The history of Corsica consists of over 3,000 years of resistance against invaders from the distant Germania, Vandals, Ostrogoths, but also Saracens, Turks, Moors, and other barbarians who brought devastation with them. These many invasions forged the character of Corsicans, who have always fought for their island and their people. One of the most famous processions in Corsica is the one in Casa Macciol in the Niolu Valley. They sing to the glory of the Virgin Mary while moving in a spiral. This is the Granitolo, a procession in the shape of a snail, getting tighter and tighter. It's symbolic of the passing seasons and of life and death. It's of pagan origin and dates back to ancient times. Mary, the real sovereign of the island, Corsicans chose in 1730 to place themselves under the protection of this queen, a religious approval for the war against the Genoese. This was a deeply religious population who would build churches, convents, and chapels all over the island. The religious history of Corsica goes back to the 6th century, when the Pope proclaimed the island the land of the Holy See. The presence of Christianity has deeply marked the culture and landscape of the whole island, and nowadays Corsica is the region of France with the most religious buildings. The height of religious art in Corsica was the Baroque, which would enhance most of the churches in the 18th century. That's the object of most of the restorations worked on by Eva Poli, a Polish art restorer who made the island her home about 30 years ago.
It's true that we always say 18th century, Baroque, etc. But when you travel around Corsica, as I have over the last few years, you do see a lot of the 18th century. I think it was also a period when they could afford it. People don't build churches when there are wars or when they have nothing to eat. They only build them in times when they can afford it. When they can say, let's make our church more beautiful or bigger because we can. The principle of a restoration is to get back to the former decoration and not to damage it. Obviously, when we have so many square meters, it might seem silly when you see us with our scalpels, but unfortunately, there's no other way. We really take pleasure in finding ancient inscriptions or decorations, or even a simple flower. We say, oh look, underneath it's wonderful. You can see that the old artists and decorators, or the sculptors, although they had limited means, had huge mastery of the subject.
With exuberant architecture, the churches were decorated with paintings and frescoes. From the greatest to the most humble parishioners, everyone came together to participate in this surge of faith which would dominate Corsica from the Middle Ages. These are architectural treasures that can be found around any bend in the path.
These are hidden treasures which have to be earned. You have to turn off the main road onto a side road. You go round a few dozen bends, and you might find a treasure.
In Corsica, the religious buildings also tell the political story of this country. In this now ruined convent, the assembly was held that decided on the revolt against the Republic of Genoa. Here in this church, the foundations for the constitution of an independent Corsica were laid down. It was the time of the Great Revolt against the Genoese, the masters of the island for centuries with whom the Corsicans were at war. The center of the island's uprisings was Corte, the inland capital of the island, the crow's nest of Corsica. In these streets, people killed each other, and between these walls, the dream of a free Corsica grew. Corte was the rebel town of General Pasquale Paoli, the general of the independent Corsican nation. He was a Democrat, a patriot, and a man of the Enlightenment. The history and heritage of this island are also bound up in the natural environment, and its vast forests, which cover almost all the land. In In the Vitsavona forest, one of the finest in France, grows the famous black pine that's endemic to Corsica, the Lauricchio pine, the king of the mountain. The Lauricchio pine is a huge conifer that can live for over 500 years. Its wood, which was formerly used for shipping or building, is now protected.
D. 75. D.
85.
67. D.
65.
Corsica is a really forested island. It's the most forested island in the Mediterranean by the area of forest and also the quality of the tree cover that you find. You only find it growing naturally in Corsica. It's been widely planted elsewhere, in France or Great Britain, but it grows here naturally. So from the point of view of Europe, it's relatively rare, so it needs to be protected for our heritage. Here you often find very tall, cathedral-like configurations like this, which people admire. So we have heights of 30, 32 meters. We measure one which was nearly 40. We've measured some Lauricchio pines up to 50 meters, so the heights are really exceptional.
Working on the Lauricchio pine today means handing down a tree-filled landscape to future generations. It means organizing the forest while considering the needs of tomorrow's world, since this tree can live for over 500 years. Across the island, hidden or in sight, over the centuries, people have left an inheritance of stone, which is blended with nature. Cucuruzzo, a fortress village dating back from the 7th millennium BC, demonstrates a prehistoric presence. In the Bronze Age, men built these granite relics, which are still immovable. In Filatosa, these unusual stones stand like stelae. Menhir statues representing human forms, warriors armed with a sword. The Neolithic stonecutters made this place the greatest center of statuary art in Corsica and one of the most important in the Mediterranean. Many islanders fled from France's political persecution, poverty, and hunger. From Cap Corse, migrants set sail for the other side of the world, South America, and its wealthy plantations. They settled in Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Peru, or Bolivia, where they made their fortune in a few decades. When they came back home, they built houses that looked like palaces. These are the palazzi of former glories, the Americans' houses.
You know, the first time I went to Ciudad Bolivar in Venezuela, it's close to Carúpano. People spoke Corsican. It was in 1960, and they were speaking Corsican. It was the everyday language.
Amazing. The influence of this little island.
Yes, and the Franceschi family.
Vincent Franceschi emigrated to Puerto Rico in 1830. He invested in cocoa and in a few years made his fortune. A few decades later, when he returned to his village, he built this so-called American's house, right down to the furniture that came from the other side of the world. This history fascinates Enrique Vivoni, a professor of architecture at the University of Puerto Rico, and himself a descendant of someone from Cap Corse. For more than 6 years, with architecture students from his university and the Polytechnic University of Puerto Rico, he has documented the 170 houses in Cap Corse, with detailed plans of the facades and the rooms of these rich homes, which are still in the hands of the families.
It's a real palace, a Corsican American palace. It's a square building with a four-sided roof, 2 stories plus the ground floor. The house is centered around the large lounge, and normally the living quarters and bedrooms are around it. But here in this house, Monsieur Franceschi tells me that his grandmother made lots of small reception rooms on each floor. But it's a great house for receiving people, for friends, and parties too. Pierre Baptistini made his fortune in Venezuela, in Ciudad Bolivar, and he said in a letter to my grandfather, "I'm going to build my little house." And it's a real palace. It's incredible and also well preserved.
There was this somewhat pretentious side to it, to show that when you left, you were nothing. But when you've come back, wealthy and successful, and you'll make sure that the whole family and related families will benefit from the wealth from South America. So when you come back to the village, you build as my ancestors did. He built a spring, a washing place, a chapel. So there was building work for the craftsmen, and then for the gardeners who tended the vines, olive trees, and as you said, the gardens.
The richness of these palaces also lies in their gardens. The garden of the Piccioni house was entirely built on rock, by hand, with countless terraces of olive trees and lemon trees. There's an ingenious system of water recovery that waters the kitchen garden and feeds the ornamental pools. With the use of 4 pools, water from the mountain flowed all around the property, irrigating the huge kitchen garden and ending up in an ornamental pool at the famous American's tomb, built lower down the slope. In their zeal, The cousins from the New World also built their own funeral chapels, monuments where they would lie and rest in their village, facing the sea. Corsica doesn't surrender itself easily on a first visit. It's so vast, so varied. It's the island of paradoxes, made up of imposing cities on the coast, peaks exposed to every wind, and as many gorges, rivers, and valleys as there are villages perched up high. Everyone, if they undertake it with passion, can thus create their own journey. It will always be unique.